Landing is a concept. You may have heard it outside of KI. I don't know why we started picking it up in KI a few years ago, but we did, and it's been helpful. If I can give you just a conceptual sense of it, life is impermanent. If there's one thing about realization that I've noticed is that the impermanence of everything, and that's terrifying when you're an ego. Terrifying because it's death. To think that everything is impermanent. I'm going to die. This is going to end. My relationship's going to end. Everything. But when you see it directly and you allow it, it's exhilaratingly freedom. That's the freedom in life, is to recognize everything is impermanent and to hold on to nothing. But so when we hold on to something, as we start, as we see more and more that life is impermanent, especially, and we start to hold on to something again, it can be really painful. Adyashanti once said is once you start to see beyond the separation and the suffering, that when the sense of separation, and here I would say landing, comes back, it can feel more painful once you get a glimpse into the impermanence of things. I think this is a really good reason why the inside out, by the way, I am coming off the end of an illness, so my energy is a little bit low if I come off a little differently today. I'm just gaining my strength back, but I feel well enough to talk to you all. And I've done this video and it didn't have everything. So I wanted to, but I can't promise to be like this perfectly joyous or enthusiastic person today. It's almost there. So impermanence, yeah, I think this is a good reason or one of the reasons why the inside out path came about as a spiritual path, not a therapeutic path or counseling or anything like that, or 12-step, because it's happened to me during the awakening process, which would be what happened. Is the seeing of impermanence and then the suffering when the anger repression held on, as an identity or as part of identification, showing up as chronic pain. Well, that experience was painful, just like Adya said, because I'd already seen, there's been a seeing beyond the suffering, beyond the separation, and then that incredible amount of pain. And then separation itself being more painful, as Adya says, let alone the severity of the pain, the level of pain that I had. So it really brought home for me what is impermanence and how does identification play into that? How do we land in different ways? So landing would be anything where we, if you think of life as impermanent, or you even see it that way, everything coming and going, then we kind of go into some perspective, pointer, platitude, paradigm, the 4 Ps. Practice, did I say that? Yeah. We land there in something that we don't realize we're landing there. Like we pick it up, we start believing it, we start doing it, which is innocent in and of itself, because it's all about exploring and experiencing and all that in life. But if we're doing it for safety, to get away, if we're on a KI path, and we very subtly or unconsciously start picking up something for safety because we don't want to feel what we're here to feel, then it becomes, it gets in the way here. It could even take us out of this embodiment path. It's very subtle and it's so easy. You have to remember that what we're dealing with directly here in third dimension is the repression mechanism, the trauma. We're making it conscious. This is why it's such a deep healing, though, because of making it conscious, or potentially deep healing. It was for me. I don't feel very healed right now. I just came off this like 2 or 3 day cold, weird feeling. Okay. Well, yeah, so it's once you get a glimpse of the impermanence, the so-called landing or permanence, there's no permanence, can be very painful. Well, anything like that can be a landing. Really, anytime we're identified with something is we'll consider it a landing. Because usually when you're identified with a belief or something, you get something out of it. And that's our utility inquiry. So the main thing I would say is if you don't know whether you've landed on a position, a platitude, a pointer, perspective, paradigm, the P's are going from 3 P's to 4 P's to 5 P's. If you don't know whether you're actually landing on something, feel into your body as you hold that belief there, or whatever that is, might not be a belief. And then say, I don't get anything out of that. And then feel into your body. Say it a few times. I don't get anything out of, for example, picking up this practice of meditation instead of doing KI. I don't get anything out of this meditation as opposed to KI. You might feel something. If you explore that, you might discover there's something that you don't want to feel in KI, or this is simply safer over here, or something. But it's really unconscious, these utilities, because they're keeping us safe. The programming is keeping us safe. It's helping us survive. So when it takes you from like a practice like KI that's getting to the root of something to something that really isn't, it's more just regulating to the system or just first dimension meditation. Again, nothing wrong with that, but the question is, what is your aim? What is your objective here? If your objective is the deeper somatic work, then going to the meditation, you might want to take a look at whether that's landing. And again, you have to just sort of poke the bear in the body a little bit to find out, like feel into the body. I don't get anything out of doing this meditation right now, instead of opening up to the anger that I know I feel for my spouse, but that I don't want to feel through KI. So you can use that utility inquiry anytime you think you've landed somewhere. And what it does is it takes you back to the KI practice, the inside out path. So you don't unconsciously sabotage yourself by landing in a certain place. That it might feel true. It doesn't mean you can't gauge your landing on whether it feels true, because your mind will always tell you that it does. That's part of the process, or the part of the mechanism. Like imagine you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't land on something that didn't feel true. If, for example, let me give you a different, instead of a practice like meditation, let's say it's a position, and the position is, this KI thing is never going to work for me. And you're like, well, that could be true, but I also could just be landing there for safety. Well, you can't consult the mind. Or you can, but it tends to bamboozle us, right? In other words, we've learned that from repression. If you do any amount of repression work from KI, you learn that. So you don't just trust your thinking mind. Carl Jung said the ego, the thinking mind there, cannot know the contents of the unconscious. So if you sit there and consult your mind, like, am I landing in this position that it's this landing, that this is going to work for me? Well, you have to go into the body, feel into the body and say, I don't get anything at all out of believing this won't work for me, KI. Say it a few times. I don't get anything at all out of believing that KI won't work for me. Say it again, because the unconscious hides. The fear that leads you to land on safety would hide in order to protect you. So you have to kind of rev that up like an engine a few times. But then if you feel something unmistakably, you're protecting yourself in this way. You're staying safe or getting love or some utility that you're getting out of it. If you stop and just listen, you'll hear it. Some people won't, though, because this conditioning stays very unconscious. We have ways of bringing it into awareness if you need help in the members area. But for now, just you want to notice if there's a somatic response. And then interpret that somatic response. You can say, what does the body have to say here? And you'll find things like, I have to stay safe, this keeps me safe, or whatever it says. Now, once you learn that you are landing on something for safety or some utility, you want to adjust your practice back to dealing with the thing that you're avoiding. However, it's not always that easy, because there's the safety mechanism that's kicked in. See, so you can't necessarily just switch your mind back to KI. You may have to do some work, because it's not just a thought that shut you down. There was a fear there of opening to something when you were in KI, and that fear, that frozen fear, often is in the body, and it's involved in it. So what's interesting about landing is like sabotage. And these words are pointing roughly to the same thing. The reason I use different words is sabotage is a word that does help us see how we're doing it to ourselves. It's our own conditioning and we're staying safe. And I often use sabotage like to point in the beginning of the process when people feel really enthused about the work for like the first few weeks, and then they hit a wall and they're like, I don't want to do it now. That's what might call sabotage, just to point them to um, how they might be doing it to themselves in the beginning of a practice. And but so then that's landing too. Sabotage is landing. But I think we're increasing the definition of landing to throughout the path to look for, because I don't know, is meditating versus doing KI really a sabotage? I guess you could argue it is. You're doing something. You're flexing that muscle of recognizing the awareness, but it's safer, perhaps. So landing might be a better word than sabotage in some cases. It might encompass more any position, practice, paradigm, pointer, perspective that was keeping us safe. And so I think you have to look for those later in the path too, beginning, middle, and end of the path. Like I landed several times on this. This is physical, this pain, or even when it wasn't pain, when it was no longer pain in my spine. Yeah, I landed on that. And I landed on that coincidentally. Each time I got close to a big layer, that wasn't a coincidence. So I get like a big layer of frozen fear, or you heard me talk about the big layer of femininity that I was blocked around, repression of that. Yeah, and then just conveniently, I would say to myself, well, this could be physical. I mean, I could just be dealing with the actual bone there in the spine, and can't inquire. The mind was just trying to find something to explain why there was such resistance to dealing with that layer. So that can be a kind of a perspective where I landed, and that stopped me in inquiry almost every time because I believed it for a short while until it took me back to inquiry. So the great thing about landing or even sabotage is when it happens and you say, I don't get anything out of doing this instead of inquiry. Um, if you take that deeper in inquiry, you'll discover that the reason that you're landing is that you don't want to feel something, and that's repression. So repression is sabotage and is landing. That's all it is. It's the trauma, and we're just calling it a different name, just as a pointer, really. But if that's your trauma and repression, it's resurfacing and protecting you in those moments of landing. But it wouldn't look like that, and it wouldn't announce itself as trauma. So, for example, I've heard people land, as I said, in the frozen fear inquiry. Because remember, frozen fear is really involved in landing. We're usually landing because we're afraid to feel something. And we're the last to know because our system's keeping us safe and keeping that unconscious. So it'll produce a belief system or start doing a practice before you even know what you're doing. Like, for example, there was somebody who I introduced repression work to, and I said, this person was a fan of Ken Wilber. And I said, but Ken says that it comes from emotional repression or repression. And they heard that and they heard Ken say that. But then they came back to me later and said, well, I'm just going to do like a bunch of this shadow work in the mind. And I thought, well, that's safe. Even though shadow work is important on the path, and I've said it, so critical from inside out path, you can get stuck, you can land in that practice if you're using it to stay safe from the actual emotion that's driving the shadow. So, for example, if I am triggered by angry people because I repress anger, well, let's just say I'm triggered by authority. That's a common shadow for anger repression. So there's the authority out there and it triggers me and I don't like it. And yeah, that's my shadow, but I don't know it. So if I do the shadow work, I might find, oh, I can't open to anger. I can't be my own authority with regard to anger. I can't allow it. So I can't allow it in him or her. So we find that, but yeah, then we find that that's emotional work to do. There's anger that I'm holding on to. See, ultimately, that's what it is. It's the mind, though, on top of that, that has turned it into a shadow. So this person was just interested in doing a lot of shadow work and not getting to the root, the emotional issue. So I can pretty much bet that that person's going to be spinning around in shadow work for a long time. It's just the same way as spinning around in ego identity investigation that you see in non-duality, constantly questioning, who am I? And not knowing where it's coming from. It could be a landing in a practice that's simply safer than feeling terror that's buried, or rage or hurt. And you wouldn't know that you're doing it for that reason because the terror, hurt, or rage is buried, and your unconscious mind is doing all this for you. Um, so there's an example of landing, but if you catch it, how would you catch a landing? So this is another thing I want to say is, despite the fact that we focus on inquiry here, awareness and mindfulness are a big part of this path. And I think this is one area where it's obvious. See, the landing is so unconscious that when we do it, we don't know we're doing it. So we just think we're picking up a new practice. And we might even think that this practice is on par with KI. And you know what? It may be. By the way, I don't know what's out there. So I don't know. You have to test your own experience. But we might pick up something that is similar in that it goes into our emotions, but we don't realize that it's going into safer emotions, for example, and not into the repression directly. Or we might realize it, but we just shut it out. We don't want to deal with that. So we start this other practice and it's getting to some emotional stuff. So we sort of fool ourselves into thinking, okay, now I'm getting to the root, but we're not, because it's not taking us to the repression, for example. So you're in this new practice and bamboozling yourself on the level of repression by, continuing to believe without checking into your body that you're doing this for reasons that you're not. Continuing to believe that, for example, you're doing it for safety, but until you check in your body, you can't know because the body keeps a score. So if you just listen to your mind will tell you, no, this practice is getting to the anger. Well, of course your mind would say that. The mind is a gatekeeper to protect you from feeling repression. So it's going to say things like that. This is how I was a non-dual teacher for 15 years and did not see my repression. It's so easy to bamboozle yourself, like super easy. It's the easiest thing in the world. It's a lot easier than doing KI is to bamboozle yourself around it because it's safer that way. But I mean, I literally, just so you can understand, I literally bamboozled myself around anger repression for 15 years as a teacher. Wow. It's staggering to think of it because that was the source of my suffering, the anger repression. The three diseases that I had came from that. So how would I do that? It was like just constant landing. Well, first of all, I didn't even know how to reverse repression back then. So it wasn't like I was able to open that can of worms of repression and start to heal and then sabotage or land. It was that I didn't know how. So my life was a constant landing. That's what the bypassing is. Land, 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 safety, safety, safety. Don't have to feel anger. Don't have to feel anything. It's really, really uncomfortable. But I can be awake and enlightened. Just bypass it all. And it doesn't work. It really doesn't work, you all. It can lead to sickness. There's the science. There's the exhibit A. So I was doing all the time as a teacher, landing in the non-dual framework, which is super safe compared to the repression, landing in different forms of inquiry that are safer than repression, and paying the price for it. Repression staying in place and creating all those things. There's almost always a price to pay for the landing and the bypassing and the sabotaging. And roughly those are the same thing for me, roughly, those terms. I like the term landing though, because if you think of life as impermanent, or if that's your experience that everything is like that, then the word landing is nice because it shows you how we're trying to hold on to something. Which, by the way, that's repression. holding on to anger, holding on to fear. But here I'm talking about holding on to a platitude practice perspective pointer that keeps us from having to feel the anger that we're already holding on to. So it's like we have, or the hurt. So we have the repression of hurt, we're holding on to hurt. And then we don't want to feel that. So we land somewhere in a practice pointer platitude, and that protects us from feeling that. And again, it's not going to happen just before you get here. It could easily happen later in the path. And it does. So I landed briefly during the healing process, and I don't want to mention the name because of this, but basically there's this movement for the somatic body, micro movements of the somatic body that were actually helpful to start kind of moving some blocked energy in my spine. It wasn't really getting to the repression, but it was moving some energy. And I felt better from it. And I had just hit a wall in my inquiry practice, third dimension, of like some serious anger and resistance to anger. And it didn't feel very good in my spine, if you can imagine, as pain. So the somatic work that I was doing actually made me feel better temporarily and therefore safer. So I started doing it every day, and I started to notice that I kind of stopped doing third dimension work. And after a while, I recognized that I wasn't getting to the root of the repression with this new thing. It's like I trailed off and I was paying the price for it. Even though I was getting temporary relief, I could tell there was no healing happening. The overall healing that was happening through inquiry work stopped. And instead, I just felt like I had to manage it every day with this somatic work. That was not okay because I recognized that that I was landing on a practice that kept me safer and made me feel better, but it wasn't getting to the healing. So I had to abandon that practice, but first I put it into the proper perspective. I kept going with it, but I brought inquiry back in. And then eventually I let go of the practice because once the pain was healed, I didn't need that. That's one example. I'm just trying to keep my own examples. You'll have your own. Let me think if I could think of some other ones here. Well, look, everything that I said in the Frozen Fear video is a possible landing. So, for example, you could land in, it could be, yeah, a belief that this is never going to work for me. Some self-sabotaging belief that, again, feels true. Of course it would. It would have to feel true. That's what landing is. If it doesn't feel true, it's not landing. So, that's a common one. Like, this is not going to work for me. I'm not going to be able to get through this. I can't reverse my repression. I'm not going to heal trauma. Yeah, those kinds of things. Listen for them, because if you go into utility inquiry, I don't get anything out of believing that. Say that a few times and see if there's a body response. Here's another thing I've seen. This is so innocent, and it does not bother me at all when people do this, because I totally see why. I did it for 15 years. Basically, they'll get into the deep third dimension work, and they'll start feeling a lot of somatic freedom. But then again, they'll hit a wall of some sort. So remember, one of the patterns about landing is usually you hit some wall in inquiry and you can't move through it, usually. Or yeah, something like that. See, I think I forgot what I was going to say. Hold on. Excuse me. Well, here's what it is. It's the non-dual landing. And I mentioned this in the Frozen Fear video. That's why I brought up the Frozen Fear. Fear is the primary, universal primary video. I was talking about how Frozen Fear stops us. It's involved in everything. Fear. And I went into great detail about that. This is similar in that fear shuts us down. So you might see some overlap here. And if you start to see overlap, good, it simplifies everything. So you start to make connections. Like, it makes much more sense. But so here you might like, what's a good example that I used on the Frozen Fear video would be deficiency stories and ego identity. But here I'm talking about the kind of ego identity that's still pretty unconscious. Like when you first do meditation, you might hear thoughts like your stories, who you think you are, all that. But sometimes you have to prompt up in second dimension the core deficiency story from childhood, like, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, I'm not heard, there's something wrong with me. Those kinds of core stories that you really feel them more in the body, they sometimes don't arise in meditation. Not not really consciously. Sometimes you have to prompt that up. You probably already learned that from KI. Well, so when you discover that, it's a big find. A lot of times it happens in second dimension because, again, it doesn't show up necessarily in meditation very clearly. Then you start seeing it in second dimension, like by saying, "There's nothing wrong with me," and here comes the story of like, "Yeah, I'm not good enough." And it was hiding for a moment there, or it hides. Once you start to see it, it's a big find. Um, and you want to process that because that's part of the childhood pattern that's creating suffering. But it's connected to the repression and trauma. Remember, if you remember your deficiency story, your false self is here because you can't feel and express these emotions, these traits that are natural for us. You couldn't, didn't feel safe. So this ego got developed, and it's part of how you stay safe. Because as long as you have that deficiency story, you don't open to that. You believe this about yourself, and then the repression is right there with it. So for years, I processed unlovable as part of a non-dual investigation, but didn't even get to the repression of anger or the frozen fear under that. So easy to do in non-duality or first dimension mindfulness meditation. Here's how you do it. You just simply don't prompt anything up, or you don't use third dimension to prompt up what's necessary to prompt up around this, which is the repression and trauma. It's so easy. It's in almost, I would say that some people are not going to like this. It's easier to bypass than not bypassing first dimension, in my view. If you're talking about bypassing trauma and repression, it's much easier to bypass. And all you have to do is just not prompt up anything deep from in the body. Then you don't get to the trauma and repression. That's not a good thing. I'm not encouraging that. I'm just saying. So let's say you get here and so the landing could be where you get into second dimension practice and you start seeing this deficiency story. And you start, because it's a big find, you might just keep going back to that. Why that keeps coming up. But you're afraid to go to the repression. Remember, your system's protecting you. So at some point, the processing of the deficiency story becomes a landing. Just like meditation and mindfulness in first dimension, I can't get to the buried stuff. Even though in second dimension, I can see some of this identity that's more core, more somatic, still can't get to the repression and trauma there. So I might get stuck just looking at identity. Stuck meaning, well, I'm getting something out of it. So the inquiry would be, what do I get out of sitting here and questioning identity instead of going to the anger that I know I've buried? What do I get out of that? Or I don't get anything out of sitting here and questioning I'm unlovable instead of going to the deep hurt that I buried. Trust your body there. So if your body says something, you're going to explore that because you're going to find the reason that you're doing it. So come into awareness. Ah, this is good. I mean, we're getting close to the end here. Once you understand the basic concept of landing, you can apply it to any position, platitude, pointer, practice, paradigm that arises, and look for how it arises right in the middle of KI. That's what I think about it. The people don't pay attention to, it's like, oh, that's convenient. That it's coming. Oh, you just entered rage. Yeah. And now you want to think this. Could that be connected to the fact that you just found rage or big pocket of shame, which has been driving things, suffering your whole life? But then you turn away from that and you're like, well, I'm going to start doing this. It's so natural and innocent. And it's not like KI is the only way to process this stuff. It's not even about KI. It's about turning away from these buried emotions and things. You could do that while you're doing KI. You could do it anywhere. Is turn away from that because that's what your nervous system is doing automatically. It's what mind's doing to protect. You just have to be conscious of it. This is where awareness and mindfulness, as I was about to say, can be helpful. Certainly helpful at the beginning of the path because these are such unconscious areas of landing. It's just being awake to experience and present and mindful helps you catch it more because you can hear your mind then. So if you're not aware, if there's no awareness or consciousness just in your everyday life, you might be believing something and mistaking it for reality. But in fact, you're believing it to stay safe. Simple mindfulness or awareness might catch it, and that's good. But processing, you won't be able to process it with that because it's buried. So if you find the landing, like you're just sitting going through the day, and because of your own awareness practice, you hear, like I did, like this is physical. And but that in of itself, just hearing it and allowing it, that's first dimension, just rest and let things be, doesn't get to the root of that, the landing in it. So if I say, I don't get anything out of believing it's physical, that's an inquiry that prompts something up. Then I feel like, oh yeah, I do. See, that's how you discover it. So simple awareness and mindfulness to catch it, because it's such an unconscious thing. And then the earnestness to take it to inquiry, to see that we're landing for safety, to not feel something. Basically, to not feel something is the safety. We also land to get love, though. And I have to tell you a funny story. Uh, you know, developing this work is like, this is not a popular route to go down. If you want to be popular as a teacher, don't do this. Do not. Because basically, as somebody said, like 20 to 30% of the spiritual community is not going to even be interested because they're here to avoid childhood trauma. And for the rest of them, there's a public awareness issue because it's like, how do you explain this work publicly? If you've done it, you know that it's virtually impossible to explain all and do it with the public. I actually have to work with a smaller group of people, I think, in the members area to really watch how the work is being downloaded and the traps and pitfalls and everything. So it's not you really can't get love with this work. Not that that's a motivation for me anyway, but it would be something to check into. So for example, some of my facilitators, I'm sure, have to check into, or my trainers have to check into. Let's say they don't want to go as deep as possible as they can in KI, because you can turn around and get your certification, go out and help people and get love and approval as a facilitator, as a trainer, as a teacher. But see, if you have KI, you can check into that. I don't get anything out of choosing to just go facilitate people instead of open to my stuff. See? And then you might see, well, no, I need their love. See, and then there's the deficiency and the trauma operating. So look, you all 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 things point back to the process here. And yeah, you're going to get love and attention, not through, I don't think you can do it through KI. I don't know, maybe that's not how I feel this. I don't feel it that way, but me bringing KI in the world gives me love or acceptance. I think I've done that work, but it could be so easy for that to be there for anybody if it's not resolved yet. Because we really, really want mom and dad's love and approval. That hung on for me until the anger repression. It was much, much less by the time of the anger repression work because of all the other work that I had done before and the shift to presence. But that didn't fully kind of let go of me. Not to say I'm done, but that until the repression work, because when you repress emotion, you have to monitor other people to make sure that you're safe and that you get their love and that you don't express something that puts that in jeopardy. So needing people's approval and love is definitely a part of repression. Remember, even if you don't see it consciously, it could be unconsciously operating. We can show it to you in the members area like that in one of our meetings. If you think that you're not doing something to get approval, just look for yourself. Just do this. Just say, I don't need to do this to get love. It's that simple, and feel the response. So that's something that we always have to be aware of because, like again, it's a bigger sell. Like if you're a teacher or a trainer to go out and talk about enlightenment, because anybody who's avoiding emotions would be interested in that. And it's a valid topic, enlightenment is actually, because there's such a thing as waking up. It happens. But to the system that's seeking safety, be- torn between two choices here. On the one, a teacher says, you don't have to clean up anything. Just wake up to your true self. And then on the other hand says, that's bullshit. You actually have to clean up your stuff. A lot of people are going to go, I'll take the door on the left, please, where I don't have to do the work because it's safer. So yeah, you could be in the middle of KI as a teacher or a trainer and decide, I'm not going to bring this to the world. I'm going to bring something to the world that's going to give me more love and attention. But you might not know that because you're not checking into your body. This work has not given me love and attention. This work has triggered the shit out of so many people. One of my trainers yesterday said, wow, you take a lot of shit. Yeah, because we're working with trauma and repression. It's certainly, I'm not getting a hit on I'm a wonderful person here. I'm also not feeling bad about myself. I'm just telling you that you don't get popular by teaching this in the world, nor do you get a hit of approval. And if you do, the work takes you right back to it, the fact that you're repressing emotion. That's why you want approval. Funny, isn't it? I think we're close to finished. I mean, I just want to say you can always land on non-dual and spiritual insights. It's a huge landing. And it's a total bamboozle because the body keeps the score on your suffering. Even if you recognize presence, remember the body, the unconscious is keeping the score. So, you could easily land on an experience or a shift or a programming that it's real and true for you. That's the thing. You could be like, yeah, presence is obviously here, but that doesn't mean the repression is not. So even if you land in a non-dual something, just stay in the embodiment process because we're doing the embodiment of presence here. So the recognition of presence is so important here. The embodiment of it is so much more important because if it's not embodied, there's still going to be suffering on some level. Okay, guys, I hope that's helpful. Take care.